I was sitting at the table, looking at the small envelope in my hands. The paper was thick, personalized with a stamp I had chosen myself for important occasions, but which now carried a weight I had never imagined I would attribute to it. My heart was heavy, but not empty. It beat with a mixture of anger and relief. There, in that instant, I knew it was time to give back everything I had lovingly offered to someone who simply didn't deserve it. The waiter, with his impeccable uniform and firm steps, approached. He looked at me, awaiting instructions, as I handed over the envelope along with a velvet-lined box. Containing a wedding ring that symbolized years of commitment, this box now seemed to carry an ironic weight. "Please give this to the woman sitting at that table," I asked calmly. My voice wasn't shaking. There was no longer any room for doubt. What had once been love was now a shadow buried under the weight of lies and betrayal. I watched her from afar, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon her. She laughed, throwing her head back theatrically, as if the world around her didn't exist. Sitting opposite her, he laughed too, leaning closer, the complicit glances between them revealing what words would never need to explain. The sight was a punch in the gut, but the pain wasn't new. It had already eaten away at me even before that dinner. When the waiter placed the envelope on the table, I noticed her smile falter. She picked it up, opened it with her manicured nails, and then stopped. The air around her seemed to freeze. Her lover, confused, leaned over to look at the contents, but she instinctively pushed the letter away. Perhaps it was shame. Maybe it was fear. I hoped it was both. My cell phone vibrated almost instantly. She had realized that I knew, that everything was exposed. I saw her name flash up on the screen, but I didn't answer. For the first time in a long time, I was in control. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because there was still love, but because the memories kept hammering at my mind. How could I not have seen it before? The lame excuses for leaving work late, the empty smiles when I asked about her day, the cell phone messages that always seemed accidental. The last month had been a practical lesson in disillusionment. Every detail that had seemed insignificant before now fitted into a devastating puzzle. Days before that dinner, I already knew. I had hired someone to confirm what my heart was reluctant to accept, and the evidence came fast and relentless. Photos of them entering and leaving places that were supposed to be neutral, but which carried the burden of a shared sin. Videos that captured affectionate gestures I hadn't seen in years. I watched it all with the calm of someone who had no more tears to shed. Even so, confronting her directly seemed a futile effort. What could she say? Deny it? Ask for forgiveness? Explain that it didn't mean anything? I already knew how it would end, an empty request and a promise that would never be kept. No, I wanted her to know, but on my terms. The letter I wrote wasn't long. There was no need for speeches. Each word was chosen with surgical precision to hurt as much as her actions had hurt me. I know everything. And now you know it's over. I imagined the scene over and over again before that night. Her getting up, stunned, trying to call me, maybe even running out of the restaurant. He, the lover, probably slumped in his chair, feeling the weight of the silence around him. But what actually happened was even more satisfying. She ran out, as expected, but tripped in her haste, a vivid metaphor for the fragility of her farce. I watched from the safe distance of my car, feeling a mixture of victory and sadness. What I didn't expect was what would happen next. An unexpected phone call in the middle of the night brought a twist I had never imagined. The lover, perhaps intoxicated by shame or the urge to protect himself, had an accident while trying to escape that night of chaos. There was no real tragedy, he had survived, but not without consequences. The scene had been witnessed by many people, including her friends and acquaintances. The story spread like wildfire, reaching all the parts of her life that she was desperately trying to keep intact. I wanted to feel satisfaction, but all that was left was emptiness. Her betrayal had already consumed everything inside me, and now, watching the aftermath felt like a prolonged epilogue. That night, I finally turned off my cell phone. Her messages piled up, like a flowing river that I had no intention of crossing. The past was dead, and what I needed now was to look to the future. Still, what would she say if she had the chance? What justification could she offer for such a calculated betrayal? I may never know. But there was something she didn't know yet, something I keep with me as the final key to this puzzle. I didn't just plan to walk away. I planned to start again. Welcome to the channel. Here we make it clear, we do not support any kind of betrayal. All the stories presented are fictitious and are intended to show how betrayal can destroy lives, erode bonds and leave deep scars. Now, get ready for a shocking story, full of twists and turns and lessons that will make you think. Enjoy the story. Marcos has always been a dedicated man. Not only to his career as a lawyer, which he built with effort and sleepless nights, but also to the marriage he swore would be his greatest achievement. From the moment he met Clara, while still at university, he knew he had found someone special. She had a unique sparkle in her eyes, a contagious enthusiasm for life and a smile that seemed capable of erasing any pain. They had built a solid history together, or so Marcos believed. The apartment they lived in, spacious and well-lit, was the result of years of working together. Every detail had a piece of them, the curtains chosen by Clara, the sofa that Marcos insisted on buying because it was the most comfortable in the world, and the bookshelves full of books that they both collected, even though their styles were so different. He, a lover of biographies and historical novels, she, fascinated by fiction and poetry. Together, they gave life to that house that seemed so welcoming, a refuge that symbolized everything they had built. But not everything was perfect. Clara, although loving and devoted, always harbored a restlessness in her soul. There was something about her that Marcos could never fully decipher, as if parts of her personality were pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. She was passionate about art and often spent hours in the makeshift studio they had set up in the guest room. For her, painting was a way of connecting with the world, but also of escaping from it. When her brushstrokes transformed empty canvases into vibrant landscapes or abstract scenes full of emotion, it was as if Clara lost herself in another universe. Marcos admired this about her, but he also felt that it was there, in that small room, that his wife isolated herself. Marcos had a very different pace of life. As a partner in a prestigious law firm, his time was meticulously divided between meetings, deadlines and endless phone calls. The constant pressure kept him in an almost permanent state of alert, but he always made time for Clara. For him, small gestures mattered, unexpected flowers, carefully planned dinners and a genuine concern to hear about her day. He made a point of reminding Clara that she was his priority, even when work seemed to suck up all his energy. At weekends, Clara liked to suggest simple programs. Walks in the park, visits to exhibitions or evenings at home watching movies. She always had a cup of tea in her hand and a dreamy look that contrasted with Marcos's objectivity. Despite their contrasts, there was a balance between them. Or so it seemed. In recent months, something changed. Marcos noticed that Clara had become more distant. Not that she was indifferent, but her answers had become vaguer, her hugs shorter. He tried to ignore it, attributing the change to tiredness or the projects she said she was working on in the studio. However, a restlessness began to grow inside him. Marcos wasn't a man for creating scenarios in his mind, but there were times when Clara's prolonged silences shouted louder than any discussion. Clara, for her part, seemed to be carrying a weight she couldn't share. She spent more time in the studio, claiming to be working on a new series of paintings that she wanted to exhibit in a local gallery. She had an undeniable talent, something that had always caught Marcos's attention, but he began to sense that there was something different about the way she dedicated herself to these works. There was an urgency, almost an obsession, that he didn't recognize. When he asked about the paintings, she would smile briefly and reply that she wanted to surprise him. The days went by and Marcos tried to fight the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers. One Friday evening, he arrived home earlier than expected, expecting to find Clara on the sofa, as usual. But the apartment was empty. The lights off and the silence gave him a strange, uncomfortable feeling. He found a note in the kitchen, written in haste, "I'll be back late. Don't wait up for me." It wasn't the first time she'd left unannounced, but something about the message seemed different, as if the words carried a subtext he couldn't decipher. Marcos felt a pang of frustration. He decided to take a hot shower in an attempt to calm his thoughts. As the water ran down his face, he found himself thinking about how they got to that point. Memories of happy times surfaced, mixed with the restlessness that consumed him. He wanted to believe that everything was fine, but there was an echo of doubt that wouldn't leave him alone. Clara arrived late that night, as she had warned him. She entered quietly, believing that Marcos was already asleep. When she found him in the living room, idly leafing through a book, his smile seemed to falter for a moment before he pulled himself together. "I couldn't sleep," he said, without looking up. "How was your night?" Clara hesitated for a moment before answering. "It was productive. I went to the gallery to check on the exhibition space. Then I stopped for a coffee with a friend." Her voice sounded natural, but Marcos couldn't help but notice the slight shift in her gaze. He didn't reply. He just nodded, closed his book and stood up. Clara watched him disappear down the corridor, feeling a knot in her stomach that she couldn't explain. For a brief moment, she wondered if he knew. But she pushed the thought away. There was no way he could have known. That same night, while Clara slept, Marcos lay in bed next to her, listening to her quiet breathing. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that the emptiness he felt was just a figment of his imagination. But deep down, something told him that things would never be the same again. He just didn't know how much yet. Marcos noticed that the days dragged on like a reflection of the weight that was growing on his soul. Clara, although she still maintained her usual routine, seemed increasingly distant. She was an absent presence, like a beautiful painting that no longer stood out on the wall. She kept smiling, attentive to the little things in everyday life, but Marcos noticed something that perhaps only those who truly love can grasp, a subtle but constant change. He tried to rationalize his feelings, attributing his doubts to the demands of work and the accumulated stress. For weeks, he let moments pass that had previously aroused his curiosity. Clara's outings became more frequent, but she always had a convincing excuse: meetings at the gallery, meetings with friends or visits to a new exhibition. Marcos listened and nodded, but the emptiness she left at home during these hours seemed to grow ever larger. One evening, while Clara was out, Marcos decided to organize the papers from a case that had been particularly exhausting. He had to pick up some documents from his home office, which was next door to Clara's studio. When he entered, he was greeted by the strong smell of fresh paint and the sight of several canvases leaning against each other in disarray. He hesitated before approaching, as if invading forbidden territory. He had never wanted to be invasive with Clara, but something about the way she had been protecting that space gave him pause. Among the canvases, there was one that was only partially finished. A male figure emerged from the misty background, with features that were not Marcos's. The look on his painted face was intense, enough to make his heart race. Marcos ran his fingers through his hair, trying to clear away the thoughts that were beginning to form. It was just a painting, he tried to tell himself, but he couldn't look away. He found himself wondering, was it a fantasy of Clara's? A reflection of what was missing in his life? When Clara arrived later that evening, Marcos tried to look natural, but she noticed his tension. "Is something wrong?" she asked, as she left her bag on the sofa. He hesitated before answering. "I'm just working. Everything's fine." Clara seemed to accept the answer, but a shadow of doubt crossed her face before she disappeared down the corridor. Marcos sat there, alone in the room, observing the emptiness around him and wondering how they had gotten to this point. The following days brought little relief. Clara was more lively, always in a hurry and full of energy for projects that seemed to have no end. She came home later and later, but always with plausible explanations. Her smile was open, but her eyes didn't match. It was as if a part of her was already far away, unreachable. Marcos tried to rescue what he felt was slipping away. He proposed dinners, suggested trips and even asked for a day off to spend together, but Clara always seemed to find a reason to put it off. When he suggested a weekend out of town, she hesitated before answering. Could it be later? I have a lot to finish at the gallery. You know how things are now. He just nodded, no longer having the strength to insist. He was tired of fighting something he couldn't name. His distrust, however, began to grow like a silent tumor. One day, when he noticed that Clara had forgotten her cell phone on the kitchen table, Marcos felt an almost uncontrollable urge to look. He had never invaded her privacy, but the doubts that consumed him were stronger than his ethics. He picked up the device with trembling fingers and unlocked the screen. There was an open message from a number he didn't know. Today was incredible. I can't wait to do it again. Marcos's breathing became heavy. He reread the message, looking for a context, something to soften the impact of those words. But there was nothing. The screen locked up again, and he stood there, holding his cell phone as if it were an object that would burn him. When Clara returned, hours later, he watched her with a look he couldn't disguise. She understood. Is something wrong? She asked. He shook his head and smiled. Nothing I can't fix. Clara seemed relieved by his answer, but he knew that something between them had changed forever. That night, he could hardly sleep. The words of the message echoed in his mind, each syllable like a blow. The next morning, Marcos made a decision. It was time to face what seemed inevitable. He hired a private investigator. Not because he wanted proof to take revenge, but because he needed the truth. He wanted to understand what was going on, even if it meant destroying everything they had built together. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. Marcos kept up the facade, acting as if nothing was wrong. Clara, oblivious to what was going on, continued with her outings and projects. Until the investigator called. I have what you asked for, he said, straight to the point. Can we meet? Marcos agreed and arranged a discreet location. When he arrived, he was greeted with a thick envelope that seemed to weigh tons. Inside were photos, message records and even a video. He didn't open the envelope there. He waited until he was at home, alone in his office. When he finally saw the contents, his vision seemed to darken for a moment. The photos showed Clara with another man, hugs that said more than any explanation she could give. Marcos closed the envelope and let out a long sigh. He didn't feel anger, but a deep emptiness. It was as if everything he believed in had been ripped out of him. That evening, Clara arrived to find her husband calm, almost distant. He kissed her on the forehead and said he was tired. He went upstairs to his room and stayed there, listening to her footsteps around the house. He knew there was a storm brewing, but it wasn't time to face it. The next day, he acted as if nothing had changed. Clara, on the other hand, seemed livelier than ever. Marcos watched her with a serenity that hid a turmoil. He knew he had to plan his next move carefully. He knew that this was not the end, but only the beginning. The secret that Clara still kept, however, was something that not even he could predict. Marcos waited until the following evening to act. Anger and hurt burned silently in his chest, but he had decided that he needed control, not impulsiveness. He chose a discreet restaurant, known to couples seeking privacy, and made sure everything was carefully planned. It was time to confront Clara with the truth. That afternoon, he had told her that they had plans to go out for dinner. Clara, perhaps suspecting something or perhaps just going with the flow, agreed without hesitation. Marcos, on the other hand, was preparing a trap. He had hired a trusted waiter to help him with what he needed. It was a calculated but necessary move. When they arrived at the restaurant, Clara seemed at ease. She chatted about trivial matters, describing in detail the paintings she was finishing for her long-awaited exhibition. Marcos listened, but his gaze was distant, as if she were just a voice lost in a sea of thoughts. Clara didn't seem to notice. Perhaps, in her security, she believed that everything was under control. Dinner was almost deafening for Marcos. Her every laugh, every gesture that had once delighted him, now seemed like a cruel reminder of what he knew. Finally, he waved to the waiter, signaling that he was ready. The man approached, carrying a small envelope that had been left on the table with delicacy. "What's this?" asked Clara, picking up the envelope with curiosity. Marcos didn't answer. He just watched as she opened it. His expression changed almost instantly. Her previously relaxed eyes widened. Her breathing became shallow and the hands holding the paper began to tremble. The letter, written in a few lines, was devastating in its simplicity. "I know everything. And now you know it's over." "Marcos," she began, but her voice faltered. "I can explain." "Explain what?" He interrupted, his voice as cold as ice. "That you've decided to destroy everything we've built for a bit of adrenaline. That your outings, your smiles, your lies, were just a game to you." Clara began to cry, but Marcos remained implacable. He knew that to give in now would be to deny himself. "You lied to me," he continued. "You broke something I thought was unbreakable." "Why?" She tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. He watched her, waiting, wanting to understand, but the answer she finally gave wasn't what he expected. I lost myself, Marcos. That's all. I don't know what made me do what I did. Maybe it was the routine, maybe it was fear of never feeling something new again." He laughed, a bitter laugh that reverberated through the restaurant. "Something new? You destroyed everything we had for something new. And what did you think? Was it worth it?" He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "I want to know, Clara. Is he everything you were looking for?" She shook her head, the tears flowing freely now. "It's not like that, Marcos. It's not that simple." He sighed deeply, as if exhausted from fighting an incessant tide. But then something changed in his expression. It was as if he had finally accepted the inevitable. "You're right, Clara. Maybe it's not that simple. But I'll make it simple for you. We're finished. Tomorrow you'll receive the divorce papers." Clara tried to protest, but Marcos held up his hand, silencing her. "It's no use. I've already made my decision. There's nothing left here to save." Marcos stood up, leaving Clara sitting at the table, devastated. He left the restaurant with firm steps, without looking back. Hours later, at home, Marcos was sitting on the sofa, a glass of wine in his hand, when his cell phone vibrated. He ignored the first call, then the second. But when the third came, he finally answered, only to hear a familiar voice on the other end. "Marcos, it's about him. There's been an accident." Marcos's world stopped for a moment. He heard the next words as if he were underwater, each sound muffled, but clear enough to understand the essentials. The man who had come into his life as an intruder, who had stolen his trust in Clara, was now in hospital, struggling to survive. Marcos hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of emotions that he couldn't fully identify. Anger? Relief? Guilt? He didn't know. All he knew was that the chaos wasn't over yet. The next morning, as Clara waited for him in the hall of the building where he had spent the night, there was something different about her posture. She looked tired, but she also carried an air of determination. "We need to talk," she said. "We've already talked," Marcos replied. "There's nothing more to say." "Yes, there is. You don't know everything." He laughed again, but this time there was a hint of curiosity. Then say it, Clara. I'm listening. What secret do you think will change anything? She looked him in the eye, her voice low, almost a whisper. I didn't just lie to you. He's not who you think he is. And there's something you need to know before all this gets out of hand. Marcos remained silent, waiting for her to continue, his patience hanging by a thread. Please, just give me this chance. Then, if you want to leave, I won't stop you. There was something in her voice, a weight that Marcos couldn't ignore. Reluctantly, he nodded. Very well, Clara. Tell me everything. But that doesn't mean you're going to change what I've decided. Clara took a deep breath before starting to speak. What she said then made Marcos realize that everything he thought he knew was just the surface of something much bigger. Marcos crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on Clara. His expression was a mixture of exhaustion and impatience. He wanted her to talk, but at the same time he was afraid of what he might hear. The tension between them was almost palpable, filling the small space between them. Speak up, Clara. What do you have to tell me that you haven't already destroyed? He said, his voice laced with bitterness. Clara took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but her hands were shaking as she gripped the handle of her bag. She looked away before she began to speak, as if looking for strength in the wall in front of her. The man you think she hesitated, as if the words were too difficult to get out. The man I got involved with is not who you think he is. That's already clear, Clara. He's not me. That's enough. Marcos replied coolly, interrupting her, but she insisted. No, you don't understand. He's not just someone who came into my life by chance. She paused, as if the revelation were an unbearable weight. He was there, Marcos. From the beginning. Planning everything. Marcos frowned, confused. He said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Clara seemed to realize that she needed to explain better, and her voice shook as the words came out. When I started exhibiting my paintings, he showed up. He was kind, charismatic, interested in my work. He made me feel seen, important. But I didn't know he already had a plan. She looked at Marcos, her eyes watering. He knew who I was, he knew about you. And he used that to get closer. Marcos took a step back, as if he needed distance to process what he was hearing. So you're telling me that he did all this on purpose? He knew you were my wife and yet. Yes. And not only that. He was after something bigger. He knew about you, about the firm, about the important clients you represent. Everything. He used me to get to you, Marcos. There was a moment of absolute silence. Marcos blinked a few times, trying to absorb what she was saying. Why didn't you tell me this before? He finally asked, his voice low but charged with intensity. Why did you wait until now? Because I was afraid. Clara answered quickly, tears streaming down her face. I knew I was wrong, that I had made a terrible mistake, but I also knew that if I told, everything would fall apart. And, deep down, I didn't want to admit that I had been so foolish, so manipulated. Marcos let out a short, bitter laugh and shook his head. Foolish? Clara, that's beyond foolish. You put me in danger. You've put our whole lives at risk. And for what? For attention? For a compliment? Clara couldn't answer right away. Her words got stuck in her throat, and she lowered her head, unable to bear the weight of his gaze. You're right. She said at last. I was selfish. I allowed someone to come into our lives, into our home, and destroy everything. But I want to put it right. I want to help him finish what he started. Marcos shook his head, disbelief evident on his face. Fix it? Clara, this isn't something you fix. This is something you leave behind. She moved closer, her voice now more urgent. He's still here, Marcos. He's still trying something. I know that. And you need to know before it's too late. What exactly is he trying? Marcos asked, crossing his arms again. Because, as far as I'm concerned, he's already succeeded. He's destroyed our trust, our marriage. What more could he want? Clara hesitated, her expression changing to something darker. Money. Information. He's an opportunist, Marcos. And he thinks he can get it because he still has something on me. Something against you. Marcos arched an eyebrow, his patience wearing thin. What does he have? She swallowed, as if each word were a weight. Messages. Photos. He threatened to use them to blackmail you. He said that if I didn't cooperate, he would go to his clients, to the press, destroy your reputation. Marcos felt his blood boil. The silence that followed was so dense that it seemed as if the air had been sucked out of the room. He took a deep breath before speaking, each word charged with controlled fury. So you allowed him not only to betray our marriage, but also to threaten my professional life? My name? Everything I've built? Clara tried to move closer, but he took a step back, raising a hand to stop her. Don't touch me, Clara. Not now. She stopped, visibly shaken, but insisted. I didn't know he would do that. I was an idiot to trust him, but now I'm trying to make amends. Please let me help. Marcos looked at her for a long moment. His mind was in a whirlwind of emotions, anger, disappointment, even a hint of guilt. He knew that Clara was trying to save what was left, but it all seemed too late. I don't know if I can trust you. He said, finally. I don't know if I want to. Clara remained silent, letting his words echo in the space between them. She knew she no longer had control over the situation, and that terrified her. Marcos picked up his coat and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned to face her once more. If what you're saying is true, I'll deal with it in my own way. But make no mistake, Clara. That doesn't change what you've done. And with that, he left, leaving her alone, lost in her own guilt and regret. Outside, Marcos took a deep breath, preparing himself for what was to come. He knew that a confrontation with the man who had destroyed his life was inevitable. But this time, he would be ready. Marcos left the house with firm steps, but each step seemed heavier than the last. The cold night air was welcome, it helped clear his mind, which was swarming with thoughts. He needed to decide what to do next. Clara's words still echoed in his mind, not because he believed them completely, but because they brought him face to face with a reality he could no longer ignore. The man Clara had described was not just a traitor like her, but someone who had more sinister plans, someone who took advantage of the fragility of a relationship to destroy much more. Driving without a clear destination, Marcos mentally went over everything he had heard. He had always thought he was a rational man, someone capable of separating feelings from practical decisions. But now everything was tangled up, as if every step he took was inevitably linked to the emotional chaos Clara had caused. He parked in an inconspicuous corner of a dimly lit street, resting his head on the steering wheel as he breathed deeply. He needed clarity, but all he had was anger. For a moment, he considered leaving everything behind. Ignoring the blackmail, the dirty games, Clara and even that man. But the idea was more bitter than liberating. He knew he wouldn't be able to live with himself if he allowed someone to subjugate him like that. His name, his career, his dignity, everything was at stake. And more than that, there was a latent need to take back control. Suddenly, his cell phone vibrated on the passenger seat. The screen glowed with an unknown number. He hesitated, but answered, feeling that anything could be an important piece on that dangerous board. Marcos? The voice on the other end was deep, firm, but carried an almost provocative tone. I think it's time we really got to know each other. Marcos was silent for a moment, trying to control the urge to shout. And who exactly do you think you are to call me like that? He retorted, his voice low but laden with menace. Someone who knows a lot more about you than they should. And someone who thinks you should listen to what I have to say before making any rash decisions. Marcos clutched his cell phone tightly, his patience wearing thin fast. Just say it. Or I'll make my decisions without hearing a word from you. There was a pause on the other end, a calculated silence. We'll meet tomorrow night. You choose the place. But if you decide not to show up, remember that I have the means to get things moving without your involvement. Before Marcos could reply, the call ended. He stared at the phone for long seconds, feeling the weight of the threat. The feeling of being manipulated was unbearable, but he knew he had to play the game, at least for now. He decided to meet in a secluded cafe, away from prying eyes. The next day, Marcos spent the hours trying to act normally. He worked on his cases, answered phone calls and even tried to appear indifferent when Clara called to see how he was. He avoided saying anything to indicate that he had contacted the man, preferring to maintain an air of indifference that made her even more nervous. When evening came, he went to the agreed place. The cafe was simple, almost empty, with only a few lights on, creating an atmosphere of uncomfortable intimacy. Marcos arrived first, strategically positioning himself at a table overlooking the entrance. A few minutes later, the man walked in. He wasn't what Marcos had expected. There was nothing special about his appearance, average height, ordinary clothes, an almost friendly expression. But there was something in his eyes, a calculated coldness that made the hairs on the back of Marcos's neck stand on end. The man sat down at the table uninvited, placing a black briefcase on the tabletop. I'm glad you decided to come. He smiled, but it was an empty, emotionless smile. Marcos crossed his arms, keeping his gaze fixed. Get to the point. I don't have time for your little games. The man laughed, a dry sound that seemed to echo in the empty space of the cafe. Always to the point, aren't you? I like that. It'll make things easier. He opened his briefcase and took out some sheets of paper and photos, which he pushed towards Marcos. Here's what I have. Messages, photos, even videos. Enough to ruin your reputation, your career, and everything you've built. Marcos flipped through the documents quickly, feeling his blood boil. Each image was a stab, a cruel confirmation of Clara's betrayal. But there was something else there, messages between the man and other people, references to Marcos's office and possible business deals he didn't know about. Did you use me for this? Marcos asked, his voice low but full of anger. I used whoever was available. The man shrugged, as if it were nothing personal. But Clara was a more effective means than I expected. She trusted me, opened doors that I would never have managed on my own. Marcos felt his fists clench, the desire to react physically almost unbearable. But he took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. And what exactly do you want? Money? He asked, trying to sound practical. It's not that simple. The man smiled again. I want access. Access to your connections, to your clients. Something that can be mutually beneficial, if you're clever. Marcos laughed, a short sound full of disdain. Do you really think I'm going to get involved with you? After all that? The man leaned forward, his gaze more serious now. I think you'll consider your options carefully. Because if you don't cooperate, the whole thing will go to the press. And I guarantee they'd love that story. Marcos didn't answer right away. He knew he was in a delicate position, but he also knew that to give in to a man like that would be to give up his dignity forever. He stood up, picking up the documents and photos. You'll be hearing from me soon. But it won't be in the way you expect. He threw some bills on the table to pay for the coffee and left, leaving the man behind. That evening, Marcos returned home with a plan forming in his mind. He knew he couldn't face that man alone, but he also knew he wouldn't give in. As he thought about the next steps, he felt something he hadn't felt for a long time, determination. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was taking back control of his life, piece by piece. Marcos knew there was no turning back. He spent the next few days carefully plotting his next move, every move precisely thought out. It wasn't just about protecting himself, it was about recovering what was left of his dignity, his identity. He couldn't allow a man like that to control his life. Especially after everything he had lost. The first step was to gather evidence. He hired a private detective to investigate the man thoroughly, looking for any detail that could destabilize him. The findings were not long in coming. Between fraudulent accounts, forged documents, and a long list of financial deceptions, Marcos found the thread he needed to pull and dismantle the entire web that man had built. However, as he prepared for the final confrontation, Marcos couldn't ignore Clara. She kept trying to make amends, making daily calls, sending messages, even showing up on his doorstep. But he wouldn't let her in. Her every attempt was met with a silence that said more than any response. Finally, with all the pieces in place, Marcos called a meeting. This time, he wasn't alone. He brought along a trusted lawyer and a team of cybersecurity experts he had hired. They met in a neutral office, away from prying eyes. The man arrived with his usual confidence, but something in his posture indicated that he knew things could get out of hand. "I'm glad you've decided to deal with this in an adult manner." He smiled, tossing the briefcase he always carried onto the table. "I hope you've reconsidered my offer." Marcos kept his expression cool, without reacting to the comment. Instead, he pushed him a new briefcase, more voluminous and clearly well prepared. "I've also brought you something." Marcos crossed his arms, waiting for him to open it. The man frowned, suspicious, before leafing through the documents. As he read, his expression changed from confidence to irritation and finally to something close to panic. "This is a bluff." He dropped the papers on the table, forcing a smile that was no longer as bright. "You have no way of proving any of this." Marcos leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. "I don't need to prove anything. This information is already with the authorities. What you see is just a copy. The next step is up to you. Either you disappear from my life, Clara's life and everything around me, or I'll make sure that every single piece of evidence is used to destroy you." The man tried to pull himself together, but it was clear that control had slipped out of his hands. He looked around, noticing the presence of the others in the room, and understood that he was trapped. Finally, he threw his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "That's all right. You win." His voice was bitter but resigned. "But don't think that erases what happened. You'll never forget it." Marcos didn't reply. He didn't need to. He knew that victory was guaranteed, but there was no satisfaction in it, only relief. When the man left the room, defeated, Marcos felt the weight of the tension finally begin to dissipate. In the days that followed, Marcos began to rebuild his life. He sold the house where he lived with Clara, deciding that he needed a new space, free from the memories that haunted him. Clara tried to talk to him once again, but this time he decided to listen to her. They met in a discreet cafe. Clara looked downcast, her usual energy and confidence gone. When they sat down, she began to speak, her voice shaky and full of emotion. "I know what I've done is unforgivable. And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I needed to thank you for not exposing me, for not destroying my life, even if I did destroy yours." Marcos listened to her in silence, letting her vent. When she had finished, he took a deep breath before answering. "Clara, what happened between us can't be erased. You made your choices, and so did I. But it wasn't just you who destroyed something here. I was wrong not to realize how far we were drifting apart, not to understand what you needed. That doesn't justify what you did, but it doesn't make me innocent either." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I hope you find someone who gives you what I couldn't. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be a better person. If only for myself." Marcos didn't reply. He just got up, left some money on the table and left. There was nothing more to say. He knew that this was the definitive end and, for the first time, he felt he could move on. Months later, Marcos met someone new. A simple woman, with a genuine smile and a look that hid no secrets. She didn't fill the void left by Clara, but she offered something different: peace. Little by little, he began to allow himself to feel again, rebuilding not only his life, but also his confidence. As for Clara, she went her own way, dedicating herself to art and a project that helped young artists find their voices. Despite her downfall, she found a purpose that kept her going. And the man who tried to destroy everything? He disappeared, his reputation ruined by the evidence that Marcos made sure was used to put him out of the game. Marcos's name remained intact, as did his dignity. Each character followed a different path, but what remained was a powerful lesson: the choices we make, especially when motivated by betrayal, come at a high cost. Some wounds heal, others remain, but it's what we do with them that defines who we are. What did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments. Remember to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Here we reinforce, we do not support any kind of betrayal. May this story serve as a reminder of the impact our actions can have. Until next time.